Fellas, we're going to be ranking every UFC main event since 2023. We're going to be grouping them by awful, poor, average, solid, great, and then legendary. Every single UFC main event. And we'll start off with awful. The worst main event I think we've had since 2023 in the UFC is Jailton Almeida versus Derek Lewis. For starters, it was in Brazil. That's already a no. You know, Brazil, in my opinion, are the worst crowd in the UFC. Derek Lewis and Jailton Almeida headlining an event. It was all right, but first of all, it was on short notice. It was supposed to be Blades versus Almeida. And I think even the fight itself, we expected Almeida to go out there and get a quick finish over Derek Lewis, which at least would have been a finish. But the fight itself is one of the worst 25-minute fights we've had in modern UFC history. It was Jailton Almeida lay and pray, literally the definition of lay and pray over Derek Lewis. No Derek Lewis highlight reel, no Derek Lewis moment, nothing from Derek Lewis. It was just Jailton Almeida holding him down the entire fight. The Brazilian crowd as well weren't doing any favours, and they were all gone by round 3 anyway. It was a weak main event to begin with, on short notice, and the fight itself under-delivered. So I think on paper it was a 3. The fight itself was a 1. The worst main event since 2023 is Derek Lewis versus Jailton Almeida. I also think Amanda Ribas versus Rose Namajunas was awful too. Yeah, I mean, women headliners is going to be a common theme when it comes to the bad main events, but yeah, this just wasn't too exciting to begin with. Ribas versus Namajunas, and the fight itself was weak too. It was a bit of a poor fight. Nothing significant took place. I think this is when the UFC realized that Namajunas probably shouldn't be headlining an event. So Ribas versus Namajunas was also pretty awful. Namajunas versus Cortez, again, this was again another short notice fight. I think it was supposed to be Namajunas versus Blankfield or something, and Cortez stepped in on short notice, which was a mismatch to begin with. And again, nothing happened in the fight. It was weak on paper for a fight night, especially a crowded fight night. It was weak. The fight itself had nothing across 25 minutes. The highlight of the fight was Tracy Cortez losing her eyelash. So another horrible main event. Mackenzie Dern versus Ribas. On paper, this was a 1, and I'll tell you why. This was because this was right at the beginning of 2025, the first card of the year. Bearing in mind, we had 4 weeks with no UFC events, and the first card back after 4 weeks, the first one of 2025, was Dern versus Ribas in the Apex. Now, I'll give it a 3 in terms of the fight itself, because at least we got a finish. Mackenzie Dern ended up getting a submission over Amanda Ribas, but for a main event in the Apex, for the first card back after a 4-week hiatus, it was awful. So this is also going to get awful category. I hope we have no more women MMA main events, unless it's for a title fight or it's like a big fight in the division. And I'm also going to go Lemos versus Jandiroba. Yeah, Lemos and Jandiroba headlining any UFC event is disgraceful. I hope this is again one of the biggest wake-up calls for the UFC that we shouldn't be getting any of these headliners. The fight itself was a 3 again. Lemos gets Jandiroba gets a submission over Amanda Lemos. That was kind of her big win, but still 2 women headlining an event in the Apex. Nobody's tuning in, even if you're a hardcore fan. And then we'll go into the poor fight nights. Poor main events. Slightly better, but still weak. I've gone with Andrade versus Blankfield. Yeah, the fight itself wasn't too bad. Blankfield got a submission over Andrade, and this was like her big test as well. But I've given it a 2 on paper. Again, I mean, it was a big test for Blankfield. This was when Blankfield, I think she'd just come off that win over Molly McCann, and Andrade was like known for being a bit of a fun fighter, but still, for a main event, it was weak. The fight itself was a 3. You know, she got a submission win, is what it is. It wasn't an awful fight. Now, we've had worse women in main events, but to main event a card isn't ideal. I've also gone Allen versus Muniz. You might be wondering why Allen and Muniz ain't on the poster, and it was because it was a short notice fight. It was supposed to be Krylov versus Span. Allen and Muniz coming on short notice and take each other on. So that was already a bit of a weak fight night to begin with. Brendan Allen gets a submission over Andre Muniz, but again, I think at this point they were both borderline top 15. Just a really weak headliner. A finish took place in the 2nd or the 3rd round, so it ended up going quite well, but again, the fight itself, just pretty weak. I've gone with Song Yadong versus Chris Gutierrez being poor as well. Yeah, this was a 3. This was actually quite exciting on paper. I mean, for a main event, it wasn't like crazy, but, you know, Chris Gutierrez was, I think, ranked at the time, and Song Yadong was a bit of a prospect, but the fight itself was a 2. Chris Gutierrez might be one of the most boring fighters in the UFC, and that's kind of what this was across 25 minutes. Song Yadong gets the win, but again, nothing significant takes place. It was a bit of a stale main event. The build-up wasn't too intriguing as well, so Song Yadong versus Gutierrez was also poor. I've got Mateus Nicolau versus Alex Perez. Yeah, this was one of the worst main events of last year. Alex Perez headlining a fight night, especially when Perez has been like, he was number 8 at the time, and he was super inactive, coming off a couple of losses. Nobody wanted to see Perez main event, and Nicolau wasn't a big name. I mean, the guy literally isn't even in the UFC anymore, so Nicolau versus Perez, really weak main event. Now, the fight itself was a 4. Perez comes back after a massive layoff and sleeps Nicolau, so for that reason, it was actually a pretty decent fight because he got a quick knockout, but on paper, it dragged it down too much in the Apex. It was a very poor main event. I've also got Mackenzie Dern versus Angela Hill. Yeah, nobody was was hyped for this. Again, another women MMA main event. Dern versus Hill in the Apex. The fight itself was a 4, though. I actually thought it was a pretty decent fight. Probably one of the best women MMA fights we've had in a lot, like main events we've had in a few years, based off the fight itself. It was actually a scrap, but again, even if the fight is good, you need a solid headliner. This ain't a headliner. Angela Hill at 41 years old, practically the Neil Magny of women MMA. You ain't getting intrigue for this fight. That's going to go in poor as well. I've also got Makhachev versus Moicano, surprisingly. Yeah, the reason I've given this so low is because it was obviously supposed to be Arman Sarukian, but no one's hyped for Makhachev versus Moicano because we know the outcome. With all due respect, it was a pay-per-view, and obviously I'm going to, think of pay-per-views as a higher standard than fight nights, but the fight itself was a 3. Makhachev gets a quick submission, but it does nothing for Makhachev's legacy. It wasn't intriguing. We're all hyped for Sarukian. At least Makhachev still got to stay on the card, but Moicano versus Makhachev is a mismatch. It was never, exciting to begin with. It was the only replacement they could have got. If anything, Dariush would have been a tougher test, so I'll give that one poor as well. I'm also going to go Holly Holm versus Mara Bueno Silva. Now, the fight itself, Mara Bueno Silva gets a submission over Holly Holm, but ended up getting overturned because I think she, had some sort of performance-enhancing drug in her. And Holly Holm, I mean, she was the person carrying the main event because she's a former champion, but again, women MMA main event, Holm versus Bueno Silva, ain't no one looking forward to that. Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington as well. Yeah, on paper, this was a 3. It wasn't too intriguing because Bilal Muhammad was the #1 contender. It was a gifted title shot to Colby Covington, but you know what? UK versus USA, Colby's going to sell the fight, but the fight itself was a 2. Nothing happened. Leon ended up taking Covington down at one point, which was a bit of a highlight, and apart from that, it just seemed like a sparring match on the feet where Leon Edwards was in control. So again, very, very poor main event. Vettori versus Dillier 2 earlier on this year. It was just an unnecessary rematch. They booked against each other again for a main event that nobody wanted to see. There was no intrigue for them, and they were both very similar in the sense they're both well-rounded, kind of just blockheads who get hit a lot. It ended up being a decent scrap, but it was hard to stay awake for 25 minutes, especially it being in the Apex. And it's not even like you've got a prospect in there. Just two, basically gatekeepers of the middleweight division taking each other on in an unnecessary rematch. Poor main event. Rozenstruik versus Gaziev. Now, the fight itself was a 3. I actually laughed a lot during this fight. It was quite funny, to be honest, because Gaziev was getting chucked in the fence face first in the octagon cage. He was sprinting at Rozenstruik and missing. But yeah, Rozenstruik boxed his head off. Gaziev gasses out, quits. It was a comedic fight, but again, Gaziev in his second fight in the UFC getting a main event against gatekeeper Rozenstruik. I mean, what are you selling? Nowadays, if Gaziev was to headline an event, it might be a 5. But back then, when Gaziev was starting off, yeah, it was never a great. I mean, to be fair, the card was actually good. You had Umar on the card. You had Mohamed Makayev on the card. You had some decent names on the card. But for a main event, I mean, this shouldn't have been the main event. So I can only give that it's got to be poor. Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad again. It was a 3. Leon was taking on the most deserving contender, but I don't think anybody was looking at this fight as if it's going to be a banger. And I've given it a 2. It was pure domination from Bilal, but nothing happened. It was similar. It's kind of similar to Chimaev versus DDP in the sense that it's 25 minutes of domination, but no damage has really been dealt. Nobody's been close to getting finished. Nothing significant has happened, especially it being 6 AM in the UK, so the crowd were dead. Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad, a fight that nobody's rewatching. I've gone with Aaron Blackfield versus Fiorot. Now, this was a 2 on paper. It was a big fight at the time because it was, I think, a #1 contender fight for the flyweight belt. Blackfield and Fiorot were both killing it at the time. The fight itself was a 3. It was a weird fight because Blackfield looked awful. She was throwing punches in slow motion, kind of just sprinting, swinging wild punches. Fiorot looked more technical, but again, women MMA main event in a crowded arena. It's going to be a hard sell regardless of who it is. Delidze versus Imavov 2. On paper, it was a 3. Imavov was not a top contender at the time. Delidze was definitely not a top contender at the time. And the fight itself was a 2. There was fouls in there. It was just a messy fight. Nothing really took place. Delidze looked awful. He looked sloppy. Imavov picked him apart, but he didn't look amazing either. It's not like the same Imavov as today. So, another really weak main event. I've gone with Josh Emmett versus Lerone Murphy 2. Yeah, this was earlier on this year. This has to be one of the worst headliners of 2025. I've given it a 3 on paper. Josh Emmett's dangerous. Lerone Murphy at the time was, I think he had 2 ranked wins, but he wasn't really a big name. And it was an awful fight. It was Lerone Murphy staying safe, picking apart Josh Emmett on the outside. I think the highlight of the fight was Josh Emmett picking up and chucking Lerone Murphy across the octagon. But again, nothing really took place. No knockout, no big moment, no finish. worst Apex main event of 2025, I'm probably going to say, so that was a very poor main event too. I've gone with Tuivasa versus Tybura now. Again, heavyweight slop is essentially the same as women MMA. You've got Marcin Tybura headlining an event. Tuivasa was, I guess, the big name of the card, but he was on a 3-fight losing streak at the time. The fight itself was a 3. It was pretty quick. Tybura takes him down, gets a submission. Easy victory for Marcin Tybura, but again, for a main event in the Apex, it's piss poor. I've gone with Sandhagen versus Rob Font. I've given it a 3 on paper. It could have been worse. I think it was supposed to be Sandhagen versus Umar originally. Umar pulls out. Rob Font steps in on short notice, but it was all right. The fight itself was a 2. I mean, Sandhagen, first of all, came in, I think, injured. He had an injury in the fight with his elbow. And it was just him kind of dominating Rob Font with the grappling, taking down Rob Font, keeping him down across 25 minutes, playing a bit of a safe fight. Nothing really significant took place. It wasn't like a super fun matchup like we expected between two strikers. It was a really hard watch, especially being Rob Font as well, which doesn't really do too much for Sandhagen's career. That's going to get poor as well. Marcin Tybura versus Spivak 2. Yeah, this was one of the worst announcements that they did for a Fight Night main event of last year. I remember when they announced this rematch. Again, another rematch that nobody asked for. And I feel like this fight perfectly represents the Apex. Just unnecessary. Two heavyweights, 2 blobs taking each other in the main event in the Apex. This is the most Apex fight ever. I've given it a 3. Spivak submits Marcin Tybura pretty quickly. Looks good doing it. But again, it's 2 gatekeepers of the heavyweight division taking each other on in a rematch that nobody asked for in the Apex. If casuals don't know who they are, it doesn't really do anything. It's a poor fight in our main event. I've gone Burns versus Brady 2. I've given it a 3. This was Brady's big fight, his big opportunity in a main event. Gilbert Burns wasn't on such a big losing streak at the time. I think it was on a 2-fight losing streak. But the fight itself was 2. It was Sean Brady picking apart Gilbert Burns on the feet, but Burns looked stiff. No finish, no big moment. Very poor main event. Manelkat versus Azumabyev as well. This was earlier on this year. I've given the fight itself a 2. Now, the fight wasn't too bad to begin with. It looked like Manelkat was picking apart Azumabyev, but then there were so many eye pokes in there as well, which ruined things because the eye pokes got in the way of the fight. And, I mean, to be fair, Manelkat did look vintage. He did, you know, he stopped Azumabyev, but because there was eye pokes in there, it made it, you know, quite poor. And again, just wasn't the strongest main event the UFC could have done. I've gone with Cejudo versus Song Yadong. This was a solid main event for a fight night. This entire card was really good. And again, Cejudo versus Song Yadong is not a bad fight night main event. But the fight itself was a 2 for the same reason. Eye pokes. I think it was Cejudo who got eye poked, and then ever since he got eye poked, the fight got cut short. It was supposed to be 5 rounds, ended up being 3. Unanimous. No, it wasn't. It was a technical decision to Song Yadong. And because the fight ended prematurely and nobody's going to go re-watch this fight, it was a very poor main event. And I've gone Jones versus Stipe. On paper, it was a 2. Now, obviously, everyone's going to tune in. The casuals are going to tune in because Jones is a massive name. So as far as pay-per-view selling goes, it's going to sell pay-per-views. But the whole Aspinall situation was going on. Everybody wanted to see Aspinall take on John. Stipe was 42 years old on a 4-year layoff, getting knocked out by Francis Ngannou. And he gets submitted by John Jones. What a surprise. The exact outcome we thought was going to happen, happened. Even at the press conference, they were chanting Aspinall's name. So we need to stay away from these type of main events in the UFC. Jones versus Stipe was a poor main event, and everybody knows why. It should have been Aspinall. Now on to the average cards. The cards that, you know, they're just average fight night main events or average pay-per-view main events. Nothing crazy, but nothing bad about them. Strickland versus Nasruddin Imavov is going to go on this list. Yeah, this was just all right. Strickland versus Imavov. Imavov wasn't a big name. Strickland's first headliner, I think, in the UFC. The fight itself was a 3 though. It was just a classic Sean Strickland fight. 25 minutes of pitter-patter against Imavov. Imavov didn't look as good as he did nowadays. Strickland looked good, gets the job done of a nasty Imavov by a 25-minute decision. Not really too much to talk about. It was pretty average. Lewis versus Spivak is going to get this as well. It was a decent main event. Having Derek Lewis in a fight night main event in the Apex, I mean, he's quite a big name in the heavyweight division, and I think Spivak was coming off a few wins at the time, so it was quite intriguing for a main event. And the fight itself, it wasn't a great Derek Lewis knockout like we expected. Spivak took him down, got the arm triangle pretty easily, so just an average Apex main event, to be honest. I've gone with Edwards versus Usman 3. It was kind of intriguing because this was after Leon just head kicked Usman into oblivion, and this was their trilogy, and the fight itself was a 3-2. I think the UK crowd definitely helped this a lot. Leon had a couple of moments, slashed Usman with the body kicks. Again, there was a lot of kind of fouls in this fight with a couple of groin shots and holding the cage. Usman taking Leon down. It was exactly what you'd expect from an Edwards versus Usman fight. It isn't a banger. It's just a technical matchup, grappler versus striker. Very average pay-per-view main event. Pantoja versus Steve Erceg. Now, this was a really good fight. This was an amazing fight. It was a 25-minute scrap. Steve Erceg did way better than everybody expected. The reason I've given it a 2 on paper is because, I mean, Steve Erceg was number 13 ranked at the time, or number 10 or something like that. And everybody was like, why the fuck is Steve Erceg getting a title title fight? What about Mohamed Makayev? What about Amir Albazi? What about any other contender? So nobody knew who Usyk was. He'd had about 2 fights in the UFC, and it was just a really random main event, especially for the fact that they were both flyweights as well, and this was the first flyweight pay-per-view headliner we'd had in years. But again, the fight was really good. It was a weak headliner, but I'll give it an average fight. Now, I'll give it an average pay-per-view main event for that. Not a pay-per-view, but an average main event for that reason. Rosenstrike versus Almeida. Yeah, this was Jairton Almeida's first main event against Rosenstrike. It was a big fight. I think it was in Brazil as well, and he gets the submission over Rosenstrike. So, in fact, I don't think it was in Brazil. I think it was in front of, might have been in the Apex. But either way, Almeida gets the submission over Rosenstrike. Just an average main event, to be honest. Grant Dawson versus Bobby Green. This was a 2 on paper. Bobby Green was a journeyman, an unranked journeyman, and Grant Dawson was this stale wrestler who missed weight multiple times. It was a very weird main event. Definitely one of the worst main events they could have done for the Apex. But the fight itself, I've got to give it a 4. As a massive underdog, Bobby Green shuts down Grant Dawson and knocks him out in about 30 seconds. So it was probably the best outcome you could have asked for. The underdogging Bobby Green gets a massive career win, sleeps boring Grant Dawson in 30 seconds. So great ending to the fight. Just it's hard to sell this fight on any card on paper. Cyril Gane versus Sergey Spivak is going to get an average as well. Yeah, this was the main event for Paris, and it just seemed like this entire fight was to build the name of Cyril Gane, give him a free win. There were a couple of people who thought it was intriguing because Spivak's a grappler, and Cyril Gane notoriously does bad against grapplers, but it was an easy fight for Gane. Picked apart Spivak. Spivak didn't really throw anything the entire fight. He was shitting himself on the way to the octagon, so for that reason, I can't really give it anything above an average. Lewis versus Nascimento. This was a 2 on paper. I think, yeah, Derek Lewis was coming off a loss coming into this fight. So a lot of people's like, why the fuck is Derek Lewis still headlining events in 2024? And he faces Nascimento, who was a nobody. He's been cut from the UFC now. Nobody knows who that guy is. Very weak on paper, but the fight itself was a 4. Nascimento has success. Lewis, in Lewis fashion, lands the massive club in overhand, knocks out Nascimento, takes his pants down, has a great octagon interview, and then he fighted out a main event where Derek Lewis is getting a good KO. You've got to give it at least a 4 on paper. So for that reason, the outcome was what I wanted. On paper, it was quite weak. I'll give it an average. Fiziev versus Gamrot. This was really good on paper. I think this was just after Fiziev lost to Gaethje, but he was still one of the best strikers in the division. Gamrot was on the rise as well. This was a really intriguing main event. 2 lightweights as well. Really good main event for the Apex. The fight itself ended in an injury, and for that reason, I've got to give it a 2. We didn't get the full 25-minute fight. Ended in an injury. It's a shame, so I've got to give it an average. Allen versus Craig. Yeah, I'm going to give this an average as well. I mean, this was kind of intriguing. This was when Brendan Allen was on the rise and Paul Craig, I think, was coming off a win over Andre Muniz. 2 grapplers taking each other. It was kind of intriguing. It was kind of like the average. This was just the most average Apex main event. Allen dominated Paul Craig across, I think it was 3 rounds. Gets the finish over him. This is, yeah, again, similar to Tiberius Spivak, the most average Apex card you could have done. Adesanya versus Strickland. Now, on paper, this was a 2. Strickland, at the time, had no business being in there with Adesanya. This was when Adesanya just knocked out Poatan. Strickland, I think, was coming off a robbery win of a robbery loss to Jared Cannonier. No, I think he just beat Imavov. But either way, Strickland had no business at the time being in there with Adesanya. But the fight itself was a 4. After a week of trash talking, a week of tormenting Adesanya, Strickland, as the massive underdog, walks him down in All-American style and picks apart and puts an All-American beating on Adesanya, wins the belt in one of the biggest underdog victories we've seen in the last few years. It was an amazing fight. It was one of those most memorable title wins we've had in a couple of years, but it was a hard sell on paper, so I've got to give this one an average. Allen versus Curtis too. I think this was short notice as well. I forgot who Allen was supposed to be fighting, but yeah, I think this was short notice too. It was actually a decent fight. It was actually a good scrap on the feet for 25 minutes. They both did well. Some people might argue it was a bit of a robbery and Curtis should have won, but either way, it was a fun 25-minute scrap. Can't complain. Again, just the average Apex main event, to be honest. Vicente Luque versus Dos Anjos. Dos Anjos was a big name at the time, and Luque was going off, I think, a couple of wins. It was a decent fight on paper, and I think we expected this to be a banger. It wasn't really a banger, to be honest. It was just a bit of a weird fight. Dos Anjos looked old. Luque didn't really look the same as he did a couple of years back. It was, I'd say, a bit underwhelming, if anything. But again, just the average Apex card a couple of weeks back. I think it was in Brazil, actually. It might not have been in the Apex. I think this might have been in Brazil, or it might, I don't know. I think it was in the Apex, but either way, average card. Hermansson versus Piper. This was a decent card. This was when they tried building Joe Pyfer. This was when he was undefeated in the UFC, coming off a bunch of knockouts, and this was his first big fight. Jack Hermansson came back after a few years. The fight itself was a 3. Joe Pyfer gets throat checked. Jack Hermansson picks him apart across 25 minutes, gets the decision win. Yeah, looked good doing it. Shut down Joe Pyfer. Joe Pyfer went on a meltdown after this, but yeah, good win by Jack Hermansson. It was, like I said, it was kind of just there to build Joe Pyfer. He didn't get built. Average Apex main event. I've gone with Cannonier versus Imavov as well. Yeah, again, this was when Imavov wasn't really a big name. Cannonier, I think, was coming off a loss to... I forgot who we lost to, but I think Cannonier was going off the loss. It might have been to Adesanya as well. The fight itself was a 3 as well. Imavov does finish Cannonier, but it was a bit of an early stoppage, so there was controversy on that. It wasn't a bad main event. It wasn't an awful main event. It wasn't a great main event. I'm going to give this one average 2. And I've got Sterling versus Cejudo. This was a 4 on paper because Sterling was the defending champion, and this was Cejudo coming back after a few years after he was, you know, I mean, he was a huge name. He was one of the greatest, and he came back after dominating the bantamweight division. The fight itself was a 2 though. Cejudo looked awful. Sterling did Sterling things. Out-wrestled Cejudo with 0 damage, 0 finishing ability, 0 threat across 25 minutes. It was just a boring grappling hugfest. Not hugfest. It was actually quite a high level, to be honest, but Sterling gets the job done. Out-wrestled Cejudo across 25 minutes. Quite underwhelming, but what did you really expect from a Sterling main event? Strickland versus Abbas Magomedov is going to get there too. Yeah, this was a 2 on paper. This was Magomedov's second fight in the UFC, and he had a main event against Strickland, who wasn't even a big name at the time. So this was a very, very weak main event in the Apex, but the fight itself was a 4. Strickland walks down Magomedov, and as soon as Magomedov, after about 2 minutes of fighting, gasses out, Strickland just puts a beating on him and gets the finish over Abbas Magomedov. And for that reason, I'll give the fight itself a 4. But again, very weak headliner. It was an average main event. I've gone with DDP versus Strickland too. Yeah, this was obviously the main event for 312 this year. This was just a very poor fight, in my opinion, because Drickus did his part. He picked apart Strickland on the feet, but Strickland had no answer to anything. And he kind of just took a beating from Drickus. I thought Strickland looked awful in this fight. It wasn't as exciting as the first time as well, because we all wanted to see DDP and Chimaev, and Strickland just got a random rematch for beating Costa by split decision. So the fight itself to begin with was never too intriguing, but I'll give this an average main event. Gamrot versus Klein. Now that wasn't even supposed to be a main event. It was supposed to be Blankfield versus Barber. Barber pulls out on the fight day, so we end up getting this instead. The fight itself was really good. It was a fun fight. Gamrot just dominated. Klein showing his fun wrestling style, looking good with the wrestling, looking good with the ground and pound. But I mean, for a main event on what was it, like half an hour's notice, it's a very poor main event. That's going to get average too. Moreno versus Erceg. This was quite weird. Erceg had already lost to 2 top contenders. He got beaten by Pantoja and knocked out by Kai France, and he was facing the #1 guy in Moreno. The fight itself wasn't amazing. It was Moreno kind of picking apart Steve Erceg just about, but again, no significant moments. So Erceg versus Moreno, that's going to get average too. Moreno versus Albazi is also going to get average. Yeah, Amir Albazi in a headliner, especially after that robbery win over Kai France, wasn't too intriguing. And for the same reason of the Erceg fight, it wasn't anything crazy. I mean, to be fair, Moreno looked better in this fight. He did pick apart Amir Albazi, but very average main event. Tyra versus Hyung Sung Park. This was obviously supposed to be Tyra versus Albazi. But the fight itself, it just wasn't great. You know, Hyung Sung Park was, I think he's got 3 fights in the UFC, and for him to be headlining a UFC event in any setting is criminal. Nobody knew who this guy was. In terms of Tatsuro Taira, he was a big name at flyweight, but he was coming off that loss to Brandon Royval. So on paper, it was probably the worst main event we're going to have this year. The fight itself was a 4. Taira makes easy work of him, takes him down, gets the submission pretty quick. So the fight itself, Taira made easy work of Hyung Sung Park, but because it was an awful headliner to begin with, and I mean, even Albazi was a weak main event, but for it to be Hyung Sung Park, just a very, very poor main event. And I've also gone Kai France versus Albazi too. I mean, it's an average flyweight headliner. Albazi was, I think, undefeated in the UFC at the time. France was coming off a title fight, so it was a decent fight. A robbery kind of ruined it because everyone thought Kai France won when Albazi got the job, but is what it is. And I've got Edwards versus Brady. Yeah, this was a 3 on paper. This was when Edwards just got dominated by Bilal, and Sean Brady was getting a bit of a step up in competition. Nobody thought this was going to be a banger. Just, again, a very average fight night main event for a crowded arena. The fight itself was a 3. I didn't mind this fight. I thought it was actually a pretty decent fight. I had a lot of people bitching saying it was boring, but at least with Brady, he tried looking for the finish against Leon Edwards. So I'm going to give it a 3. Leon looked awful in the fight, but Sean Brady did his part, got the finish, dominated Leon. So I'll say this was an average main event. I've gone with Merab versus O'Malley too. Yeah, this was a 3 to begin with because O'Malley got an immediate title fight against Merab after doing nothing in between. The fight itself was a 3. Merab dominates O'Malley as expected, actually gets his first finish in a few years as well, so it was good to see Merab get a finish. So, again, average main event. If this would have been like O'Malley after he got another 1 or 2 wins, I probably would have given it a 4 on paper, because I think the rivalry between the two of them was actually quite good, but it was a bit of an undeserved title fight. It kind of went how we expected, so I'll give it an average main event. Corey Sandhagen versus Davison Figueiredo. This was a 4 on paper. Whenever you've got the likes of Jan and Figgy and Sandhagen in main events, it's going to be one of the most skilled matchups you ever see, and that's what we expected. But the reality was, Figgy looked awful. He looked awful the entire fight. Kind of took a beating from Sandhagen and then got injured in the fight, and I think it ended in the second round for that reason. It's one of the most forgettable main events of this year, which is unfortunate because it could have been one of the highest levels. So for that fight, I've got to give this average 2. Really good on paper, but the fight itself underwhelmed. I've gone with Alex Perez versus Tyra. This was a 4 on paper. This was when Tyra was undefeated off a bunch of wins, the best flyweight prospect, and Perez had just knocked out Matheus Nicolau. So for a flyweight main event, I was actually really enticed. The fight itself was a 2. Alex Perez can't keep momentum. He took a bit of a grappling beating from Tyra, then got injured in the fight, and any main event that ends in an injury is a poor main event, so that's a very average card as well. Alex versus Ankalaev, I'm going to say this was average 2. This was a 4 on paper. I mean, any fight with Alex is probably going to be at least a 4 or above on paper, because this was when he had his crazy year of 2024, and the only guy he hadn't beat is the boogeyman of the division in Ankalaev. It was a big main event. The fight itself was a 2 though. By far Alex's worst fight in the UFC. He didn't do anything on the feet. If anything, he looked bad on the feet. And it was just a stale fight. Low action on the feet. Ankalaev holding Alex against the cage. Probably the worst pay-per-view main event, or one of the worst pay-per-view main events we've had of this year. So Alex and Ankalaev, I'm going to have to give that a very average. I've gone with O'Malley and Merab the first time around. This was a 4 on paper because O'Malley was the champion. He was the best striker in the UFC with knockout ability, and Merab was just beating everybody. So it was literally the best grappler versus the best striker in the division. We're all intrigued. The fight itself was a 2 though. Merab dominates O'Malley, but didn't do anything. He didn't damage O'Malley. He didn't come close to finishing O'Malley. O'Malley looked pretty poor on the feet as well. Apart from that body kick in the 5th round, nothing else really happened. So O'Malley versus Merab is going to have to get average as well. It kind of underwhelmed, if anything. Now we're going to go on to the solid cards. The main events that I thought was actually a pretty solid main event. Nothing crazy, but I'd say this is definitely an above average main event. I'm going to start off with Glover Teixeira versus Jamal Hill. This was obviously for the vacant light heavyweight belt. It was alright. This is when Glover Teixeira was coming off a loss, and I think this was a very short notice title fight as well, so it wasn't a bad fight. We're intrigued to see the fight, and I'll give the fight itself a 4. It was actually quite fun to see. Jamal Hill, this is the best Jamal Hill's ever looked. Picked apart Glover Teixeira, looked good across 25 minutes, and again, Glover had his moments too. This was actually a decent scrap across 25 minutes, so really good fight. Average main event itself, but I give the overall main event of the fight and the build-up, I give it I'd say it's pretty solid. Merab versus PTN. Yeah, on paper, this was a 4. PTN had just come off, I think, a title fight. No, he just came off that loss to O'Malley, and Merab at this time was smoking everyone. He smoked Aldo, and he was on this big winning streak, so it was actually really enticing as a main event. I'll give it a 3 though, even though nothing really happened in the fight itself. This was probably Merab's most dominant performance in his entire career. For 25 minutes, he just wrestled the fuck out of PTN. In my opinion, his most dominant performance he's had in his UFC career so far. So for that reason, I've got to give it a 3. And again, very solid main event. Then we've got Marlon Vera versus Corey Sandhagen. Yeah, on paper, this was a 4. This was a very intriguing fight. I think at the time, Vera was coming off that knockout. Was he coming off a win? He was either coming off, I think he was coming off that knockout win over, what's his name? Dominic Cruz at the time. So we're all intrigued to see Vera. And in terms of Corey Sandhagen, I think Sandhagen was coming off a win too. So it was a very intriguing fight. We all saw this as a title eliminator. The fight itself was a 3. It wasn't the stand-up scrap that we expected. We thought it was going to be a war on the feet. It was kind of just Sandhagen dominating Vera with the wrestling, which, to be fair to him, he looked good doing so. But it was a little bit underwhelming. But still, I'd say everything into account, it was an above average main event. I'd say this was solid. I've gone with Song Yadong versus Ricky Simon. Yeah, this was just the average Apex main event. Song Yadong was a massive prospect. Ricky Simon brought the fight every time. And to be fair, it was a 4. Song Yadong gets a good knockout over Ricky Simon. Song Yadong, the prospect at bantamweight, sleeps Ricky Simon in good fashion, out cold. So everything you could want. This was a very solid main event. I'm also going to go Nunes versus Aldana. Now, this was awful on paper. And I do hope that this is the last women MMA main event we have on a pay-per-view, because any women MMA fight on a pay-per-view is going to drag things down. But I've given it a 5. This was probably one of the best women MMA fights I've ever seen. It was an absolute scrap. Aldana brought it to Nunes. Nunes brought it to Aldana. Like I said, they did not disappoint. So the fight itself was amazing. It was quite weak on paper. Everyone was watching this card for Oliveira. But because of the fight itself and how good it was, I've got to give this at least a solid. So this was a solid main event. Duplessis versus Chimaev. Yeah, this was very underwhelming. We thought, well, I said this was literally the best versus the best. DDP, undefeated in the UFC, beat everyone. Chimaev, unstoppable, beating everyone. This is definitely probably the best fight on paper we've had of 2025. Literally the definition of the best versus the best. Two guys who were unstoppable. And the fight itself, again, it was domination from Chimaev. Just like Merab in some of his fights, domination from Chimaev. But he didn't do anything to DDP. He didn't damage him. He didn't come close to finishing him. He didn't pull off a submission like we expected. It was kind of just 25 minutes of domination, but a lackluster fighting. So I'm going to have to give this solid though. Just because of how exciting it was and how high level it was. I think this is safe to say this was a solid main event, but the fight itself kind of let things down even though it was domination. But I'd still say everything into account. For the middleweight belt, the best versus the best, this was solid too. Tom Aspinall versus Marcin Tybura. This was the big return after Aspinall after he got knocked out, or after he got injured by Curtis Blades. And he did exactly what we thought he was going to do. Danced around Marcin Tybura and knocked him out in the first round. So for that reason, solid main event. Tom Aspinall's big comeback. Sleeps Tybura, everything you could want, solid main event. Sadiq Youssef versus Barboza. Bit of a weird fight on paper. Barboza wasn't in the best form of his career, and Sadiq Youssef was still a bit of a prospect at the time, but this was an amazing fight. This was an amazing scrap across 25 minutes. Youssef brought it to Barboza. Barboza had his moments and ended up winning the fight as well. So this was a really good Apex main event. Probably one of the best Apex main events we've had in the last couple of years. So Youssef and Barboza, this was a solid main event. Makhachev versus Volkanovski 2. Now, I've given this a solid because on paper, this was when Volkanovski, I mean, don't get me wrong, two champions taking each other on, he's always going to be massive. But my justification for this is at the time, Volkanovski, first of all, just lost to Makhachev. I know he picked up a win over Yair, but this was on short notice as well, which kind of ruined things. It was on 12 days notice, which, you know, wasn't the most hype. Volkanovski was drinking, wasn't fight ready, stepped in on short notice, and he got knocked out in the first round, which I guess was great for Makhachev. But again, because it was on short notice and Volkanovski shouldn't have been in there with Makhachev to begin with, it should have, you know, just been a different contender like Gamrot. It kind of let things down, you know. If I wish they'd have rematched each other on like a full training camp rather than Volkanovski rushing to get back in there, because he kind of ruined things. It was still a solid main event, massive fight and a knockout, but because of the circumstances with Volk, I'm going to say it was solid. Moreno versus Royval 2. This was very exciting on paper. This was short notice. I think it was supposed to be Moreno versus Albazi or someone else, but Royval steps in on short notice. And we all expected it to be a banger. I thought Moreno looked off in this fight. Royval did his part, brought the fight to Moreno, but Moreno just looked off. He had a very low output style. Still a solid main event. Like I said, the best versus the best you can get in terms of a fight night main event in the flyweight division. But overall, I thought it was just a solid main event. What you want, probably like one of the better flyweight main events you're going to get. Cannonier versus Barallo. This was an average Apex main event in the sense that, you know, you've got this young, hungry contender, Caio Barallo. You've got Cannonier, who's a bit of a gatekeeper for the top 5 in this division. And it was actually a pretty good fight. It was a good stand-up fight across 25 minutes. Fun scrap. Barallo had his moments, picked up Jared Cannonier. Cannonier fired back. This was a really good Apex main event. And again, solid main event for the UFC. Ian Gary versus Carlos Prates. I've given this one average as well. Yeah, this was a very average, not average. I've given this one solid as well. Yeah, this was Carlos Prates. This was when Carlos Prates was undefeated in the UFC. He was knocking everybody out, and he took on Ian Gary, who was one of the top contenders, just came off that very close fight to Shavkat. A very close fight on paper. Some people thought Prates was going to starch him. Some people thought Gary was going to get the job done. The fight itself wasn't bad by any means. It wasn't amazing. There was no finish. It was Gary outstriking Prates across 25 minutes, and Prates could have finished him in the 5th as well. So this was a solid main event. Good build-up. Solid, good fight itself. Does a lot for the welterweight division, so solid main event. Whittaker versus Derrida. This was very exciting on paper. Randy Derrida was, I think, 3-0 in the UFC, taking on one of the all-time best in Robert Whittaker. Huge step up in competition. We thought this could have been a title eliminator too for Randy Derrida. So this was a big fight on paper. The fight itself was a 3. Bit of a weird fight. I think this is where we start to see that Whittaker was a bit off the beat. Whittaker didn't really look amazing in this fight. He looked a little bit off. Randy Derrida looked a bit sloppy as well. You know, he was grabbing the gloves of Robert Whittaker, and again had that weird sloppy style that Randy Derrida does have. So it was a solid main event. I mean, if you got Whittaker in a main event in a fight night, it's going to be solid. But yeah, solid main event, nothing crazy, but I'd say it was still above average. Ankalaev versus Walker 2. I'm going to give this one a solid 1 too. Yeah, this was, I think, yeah, they fought at UFC 294, ended in a doctor stoppage, so they rebooked them for the first fight of 2024. And Ankalaev did his part. He knocked out Johnny Walker out cold in, I think, the 3rd round, and for that reason, solid main event. And it did a lot for the division. This was supposed to be a title eliminator for Ankalaev too, so it meant a lot for the light heavyweight division. Sandhagen versus Umar. This got a 4 on paper. You literally had Sandhagen, who was coming off 2 wins. Umar, this Khabib prototype who was undefeated, #1 contender fight for the bantamweight belt. This was a massive fight, and the fight itself was a 3-2. Yeah, it wasn't a boring fight. It was one of the highest level main events we've had in a few years. Umar beat Sandhagen with wrestling. Looks good doing so. It was a very competitive matchup. Sandhagen defensively did well. This was a solid main event. Big title eliminator for the bantamweight division. Renato Moicano versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Yeah, I love this main event as well. I mean, you've got Moicano, who's a big name. Benoit Saint-Denis coming off that loss to Poirier, headlining in France. And the fight itself was Moicano spoiling the show as an underdog, going to France and beating the absolute shit out of Benoit Saint-Denis, which in hindsight has aged really well. So for a main event, Moicano versus Saint-Denis, definitely a solid main event. I enjoyed this a lot. Usman versus Buckley. Yeah, this was a massive fight too. This was when Buckley was on the rise. Usman was a former champion. This is the best you can get for a fight night main event. Literally an amazing card on paper. The fight itself was a 3. Usman dominated Buckley with the wrestling. They had a nice little scrap in the 5th round, but Usman dominated Buckley for most of the fight and looked good doing it. Prime vintage Usman. So again, very solid main event. Magny versus Protes. It was I'd say a pretty average Apex main event. Protes at the time was coming off a win, I think, over Li Jingliang. Wasn't really a massive name at the time, and Neil Magny's Neil Magny. He's the gatekeeper of the welterweight division, and the fight itself was a 4. Protes absolutely flatlines Neil Magny, knocks him out cold, and for that reason, I've got to give this one at least a solid, because what else do you want in a main event? Burns versus Morales. Similar to that reason, you've got this prospecting Michael Morales taking on the old veteran in Gilbert Burns, and Morales goes out there, starches Burns pretty quick. Solid main event, does a lot for the middle for the welterweight division. Big fight there. Delite versus Hernandez. Now, on paper, this was a big main event. Hernandez, I think, deserved a main event. He needed one in a while. I know he main evented against Pereira, but he needed to be back in those main event slots, and he fucking dominated Delite. This is one of the most dominant main events we've had in a few years. Hernandez ragdolls Delite, drags him from pillar to post, beats him from pillar to post. It was a bullying in there, and he gets the submission of a Roma Delite, and he looks great doing it. You couldn't have asked for a better performance from Hernandez. Solid main event. Bilal Muhammad versus JDM. Yeah, on paper, this wasn't the best. JDM wasn't even the #1 contender getting a title fight, and Bilal Muhammad's Bilal Muhammad. It's never going to be a great main event, but I thought this was a really good fight. Bilal stood for most of the fight, and they actually had a decent scrap. It was a good 25-minute fight on the feet. JDM picking apart Bilal, but Bilal firing back forward, shooting takedowns here and there, landing some shots here and there. This was a good scrap across 25 minutes, and I'd say this was a solid main event, especially for the belt as well. I actually enjoyed that fight as well. Probably Bilal's most fun fight in the UFC. And now we're into great main events. These are ones that stand out for being great. These are very good main events. Just great main events. We've got Marvin Vettori versus Jared Cannonier. Now, on paper, this is just the average Apex main event. You've got Vettori, the blockhead, versus Jared Cannonier, who I think was coming off a loss to Adesanya at the time, if I remember. But the fight itself was I say it was a scrap. It was more of a bullying from Jared Cannonier. It was like watching Jared Cannonier punch a punching bag across 25 minutes, but that punching bag was in human form, called Marvin Vettori. Vettori's chin was the most impressive part of this fight, how he didn't get knocked out, but yeah, really good scrap, 25 minutes. You couldn't go 10 seconds without either of them throwing a punch at each other. It was an amazing fight. So I'd say this was a great main event. Covington versus Buckley. Now, this is good on paper. You know, Colby Covington's a massive name, former champion. He's going to sell a fight, especially for it being a fight night. And Buckley just slept Wonderboy. And the fight itself was a 4-2. Buckley just picked apart and beat the absolute shit out of Colby Covington for the time the fight lasted. It was a little bit let down by the fact that there was a doctor stoppage in the fight, but I didn't see the fight going any other way, to be honest. It was just domination from Buckley. He looked great doing it. So Covington versus Buckley, great main event in every aspect. Pete Yan versus Figge. Like I said earlier, if you've got Yan and Figge or Sandhagen or any of the top bantamweight contenders, it's going to be one of the most high skill fights you've seen in a while, and this is exactly that. You've got Figge, who was coming off a few wins, Yan, who was, I think, coming off a win as well, well. This is one of the highest level fights we've seen, honestly, in modern history. You don't get a more high level than this. So for that reason, it's going to be a great main event. Great on paper, great outcome. It was a very back and forth high level fight. That's going to get great as well. I've gone Holloway versus Allen too. Yeah, this was when Allen was undefeated in the UFC. Allen had just steamrolled Dan Hooker, I think, or he might have beaten Calvin Kattar, but he was coming off a big win. And Max Holloway is Max Holloway. If Max Holloway's headlining a fucking fight night, you know it's going to be sick. And it was a good scrap. It was a good scrap across 25 minutes. That 5th round highlight where Allen goes to, go and finish Holloway, lands a couple of big shots, and then Holloway drops him. This was a really good main event. So Allen versus Holloway, great main event. Hernandez versus Michel Pereira. Now, I was so excited for this on paper. Michel Pereira was on this big win streak. Hernandez was on this big win streak. This was two of the best borderline top 15 guys you could have put them against each other, and it was that. And the fight itself was just domination from Hernandez. Absolutely dominates Michel Pereira, bullies him across 25 minutes. If you're into people getting mauled and absolutely starched on the ground, watch this fight. Hernandez fucking bullied him like he owed him money, and then it gets the finish as well to put the cherry on top in the 5th round. One of the most enjoyable main events to watch, and again, it was exciting on paper too because they were both killing it at the time. So great main event, Hernandez versus Pereira. Cannonier versus Rodriguez too. Now, this was similar to Joe Piper versus Jack Hermansson, where you've got this prospect of the middleweight division in Greg Rodriguez taking on Cannonier, the veteran of the division. And I've given this a 5 in terms of the fight itself. The fight started off, and RoboCop was kind of bullying Cannonier. He was way bigger. He dropped Cannonier, nearly finished him in the first couple of rounds. And then he gasses out, and then Cannonier goes for the kill, and he gets the finish on RoboCop. They both had their moments. They both dropped each other. They both damaged each other. It was quite a short fight as well. I think it was only 3 rounds. So for a main event, this was a great main event to watch. Exciting. Everything you could want in an Apex fight. I've gone with Edson Barboza versus Lerone Murphy too. Yeah, this was probably one of the best fights and one of the most underrated fights of 2024. On paper, this was just an average Apex main event, but the fight itself, it was amazing. It was a back and forth scrap on the feet. Barboza firing back against Lerone Murphy. Murphy showing his stand-up as he picks apart Edson Barboza. Look at the faces of both of them as well after the fight. They were both bloody and bruised. You put this in front of a crowd and the crowd are going to be going wild. So this was a great main event. Grasso versus Shevchenko too. Yeah, I don't mind women in main events on a fight night when it's for the belt. If you've got a title fight as a fight night main event, I've got to immediately give it like a 4 on paper. And I thought the fight itself was good. It was high level. They both had their moments on the feet. It wasn't as boring as the third fight. For a women in main event, this was literally the best you can get. So Grasso versus Shevchenko too. This was a great main event. In Mexico as well. Mexico always deliver. This was a great main event. Walker versus Mingyang Zhang. We all expected this to be the big coming out party of Mingyang Zhang. In China, beats Johnny Walker, does it easily, but the fight itself was the most Johnny Walker output you could have asked for. Bad start against literally the worst possible matchup you could have given him, and he pulls off a finish. The most Johnny Walker main event ever. So I'm going to say that was a great main event, just because of the shenanigans that Johnny Walker pulled off. I've also gone with Pantoja versus Kaya Sakura. This was exciting on paper because Pantoja was killing everybody in the UFC. You've got Kaya Sakura, this champion, this big threat from a different organization, and Pantoja just shuts him straight down. I think his second main event in the UFC, grabs a hold of Kaya Sakura, takes him down, chokes him out easily, and this was where we started talking about Pantoja potentially being one of the all-time greats, not only in the flyweight division, but in the entirety of the UFC. So, again, very, very great main event. Lewis versus Teixeira. Again, similar to the Nascimento fight, this was just an average Derek Lewis in the main event again, but he was taking on Talisman Teixeira, who was this undefeated knockout artist, and it was the most Derek Lewis main event you could have asked for. In about a minute, drops Talisman Teixeira, finishes the fight, takes his pants down, releases one of the best post-fight octagon interviews you could have asked for, and any Derek Lewis main event has to get the respect. It was a great main event. I don't mind these once-a-year Derek Lewis main events, where he just goes up, shows up, does his thing, gets the paycheck, rocks the mic, and then goes home. Very good main event. This was great. Strickland versus Duplessis. Now, the first time around, I thought this was very good. Strickland was the champion. DDP was undefeated in the UFC. They had this huge rivalry going on, so the build-up was amazing. And I thought the fight itself was amazing too. This is one of the best fights of 2024. They scrapped for 25 minutes. Strickland actually looked like he wanted to win. Dricus looked like he wanted to win. They both bullied each other on their feet. So for 25 minutes, this was an amazing fight, an amazing build-up. Great main event. Jamal Hill versus Khalil Roundtree in Baku. Yeah, this was exciting to begin with. You've got two heavy punches on the, or two heavy strikers on the feet. Jamal Hill, who's known for his KO ability. Khalil Roundtree, who's coming off that amazing performance over Alex Pereira, and the fight itself was a 4. Now, Jamal Hill didn't really do anything, but Khalil Roundtree was on point, just absolutely bullied Jamal Hill on the feet, bullied him with the Thai boxing. Jamal Hill clipped him a few times, but it did nothing, and yeah, Khalil Roundtree just beat the crap out of Jamal Hill, dropped him a few times. Great main event. I've also gone with DDP versus Izzy. Yeah, this is a 4 on paper. I mean, to be fair, those people arguing that Adesanya didn't deserve a title fight, but the rivalry that these guys had, Adesanya getting a title fight, the champion DDP, the rivalry that they had in the fight itself was a 4-2. DDP was kind of losing to Adesanya, and then DDP being DDP finds a way to win, takes down Adesanya, gets the submission win. And yeah, this is a great main event as well. Very exciting. Brought in the casuals as well because Adesanya's got a big name. Great main event. Sergey Pavlovich versus Curtis Blades. Yeah, this was when Pavlovich was on the rise. He had 5 first-round knockouts in a row, and this was his big kind of title eliminator against Curtis Blades, who I think was coming off a win too. So it was exciting on paper, this new heavyweight prospect, and the fight itself went exactly how we expected. Pavlovich just running through Curtis Blades like a hot knife through butter. TKOs him in the first round, and to be fair, Pavlovich hasn't been seen since. We haven't seen this kind of aggressive version of Pavlovich since the fight with Curtis Blades. So, in memory of old Sergey Pavlovich, I'm going to have to say this was a great main event. Adesanya versus Imavov. That's great too. Yeah, this was Imavov's big fight. His big main event against Adesanya, who's obviously a former champion. And Adesanya being in a fight night main event automatically has to be a 4. And the fight itself was a 4-2. I mean, Imavov went out there and starched Adesanya. What more could you ask for? So, yeah, great main event was Adesanya and Imavov. Imavov getting his big win over Adesanya. I've gone with Holloway versus Poirier 3 now. The reason it's not a 5 on paper is because, yes, they're both big names, but, I mean, Poirier already said he's going to retire. Neither of these guys, at least Poirier, wasn't in the best form of their career. It wasn't for an actual belt as well, but it was a great build-up. You know it's going to be a scrap. They're 2 big names. You know exactly what we're going to get from Holloway and Poirier. And it was exactly that. The fight itself, 25 minutes of just scrapping. It was mainly Holloway picking apart Dustin Poirier, but they both had their moments. They both looked really good on the feet. They were both picking each other apart. Exactly what you expect from Holloway versus Poirier. I think the only thing stopping it from being a 5 was the lack of engagement in the last 10 seconds from Dustin Poirier. If Poirier would have stood there and thrown down with Max Holloway in the last 10 seconds, I think it could have been a 5. But either way, it was still a great main event. The send-off of Dustin Poirier, great fight and a great main event. Dariush versus Sarukian is going to get great as well. Yeah, this is great. This is Sarukian, his big fight, his first main event in the UFC, or his second main event in the UFC, as he took on Beneil Dariush after Dariush lost to Oliveira. So it was exciting to begin with. Big lightweight main event, and Sarukian goes out there and knocks him out in about a minute. Knocks out Dariush in about 1 minute, and yeah, everything you can want in a main event. Great main event. And then we've got Josh Emmett versus Ilia Topuria. You had undefeated Ilia Topuria, who was like the next big thing in the featherweight division, evidently, against Josh Emmett as well. And the fight itself was kind of a bullying to begin with. Topuria just beat the crap out of Josh Emmett across 25 minutes. Bullied him on the feet. Had pretty much a 10-7 in that 4th round as well. It was complete bullying from Topuria. Beat the shit out of Josh Emmett. And this was kind of his title eliminator too. So again, great fight night main event. Whittaker versus Ikram Aliskerov. Now this is a 3 on paper because Ikram only had about 4 fights in the UFC. It was obviously supposed to be Chimaev, which would have been a massive fight night main event. But yeah, Ikram Aliskerov steps in on short notice. But I've given it a 5 because this was when Whittaker was coming off that win of Acosta. He needed a big win. People were even counting him out against Ikram Aliskerov. And then Whittaker and Whittaker style goes out there and sleeps Ikram Aliskerov, knocks him out in the first round, takes away that takes away that big win streak, sleeps Ikram Aliskerov in the first round, and I was just happy to see Whittaker go in enemy territory and get a big win in that fashion. So this was a great main event. Ikram versus Whittaker, great main event. Imavov versus Barallo that we just had a couple of weeks back. This was great too. I mean, the build-up to this was exciting. You had Brazil versus France, the Fighting Nerds versus France, you know, Barallo versus Imavov, the title eliminator of the middleweight division. Winner takes on Chimaev. And I've given the fight itself a 4. Now, was it a 25-minute absolute barn burner scrap? No, but it was high level. 2 of some of the best strikers in this division, both having success, both picking each other apart. Imavov looking rapid on the feet. I thought the main event was very good too, so especially with the French crowd backing Imavov. So great main event, Imavov and Barallo. These are the fight night main events we need to be having more often. This is the definition of what we need in a fight night main event. Volkanovski versus Lopez at UFC 314. This was also a great main event. Now, this is when Volkanovski was coming off a few losses, so we're a bit wary of Volkanovski getting back in there, and Lopez was coming off that win, I think, of Brian Ortega. So we're excited to see Volkanovski get back in there, and I've given it a 4 on paper because it was a great fight. Volkanovski got caught a few times, didn't get knocked out. It was just a good scrap across 25 minutes. Volkanovski picking apart Diego Lopez. Lopez walking forward with that blockhead and firing back. This was just an amazing card in general, an amazing main event. Volkanovski winning the belt back as well was great to see. Great main event. O'Malley versus Marlon Vera, another great main event. Yeah, this was O'Malley against a rival in Marlon Vera. They had this big rivalry together. O'Malley had just knocked out Aljamain Sterling. So the build up to this, and especially O'Malley defending his belt, was a huge opportunity. And the fight itself, it was just a beating from O'Malley. It was like punching a punching bag. He was picking apart Marlon Vera. And Marlon Vera, credit to his chin, just kept walking forward, eating bombs, didn't get dropped, didn't get knocked out. And O'Malley just beat the absolute shit out of Marlon Vera for 25 minutes straight. So it was a great main event. Exciting build-up, bully performance in the fight. Great main event. John Jones versus Cyril Gane. This was great too. This is the big return of John Jones. Yes, he ducked Ngannou, but it was the massive name in the sport. Coming back after retirement against Cyril Gane, this new heavyweight. Well, not new because he already lost to Ngannou, but this, this new breed heavyweight. So the fight itself on paper was intriguing. Jones' big fight at light heavyweight in the heavyweight division. And I've given the fight itself a 4. Easy win from John Jones. Takes down Cyril Gane, wins the belt, cements his legacy. And I think if Jones would have retired after this fight, it would have done more for his legacy than if he'd have stayed around and fought Stipe. So great main event. Jones hadn't been ducking anybody at this point. Well, he ducked Ngannou, but it wasn't as bad as the Aspinall situation. So Jones versus Gane, I'll give this a great main event too. Ilia Topuria versus Charles Oliveira, another great main event. I mean, there was a little bit, it's not, I've given it a 4 on paper. I think for it to be a 5, it would have had to be like Topuria versus Makhachev for it to be a 5, or Topuria versus, I don't know, like a massive name. But I've given it a 4. Oliveira, it was coming off that good win over Michael Chandler. Ilia Topuria moving up to the lightweight division. It was a massive, massive fight on paper. Probably the biggest we're going to get this year. And I've got to get it a 4. Now, it was a shame seeing Oliveira get starched out like that. But Topuria doing Topuria things, moving up a weight class, easily dismantling and knocking out Oliveira, the biggest loss he's taken in his entire career, as he wins the lightweight belt. Great main event, great build-up. Again, sad to see he's an Oliveira fan, but regardless, Topuria, just cementing his legacy even more as one of the most dangerous men in the UFC, and pound for pound top 3. Great main event. I've gone with Sterling versus O'Malley as well. Yeah, this is quite a 3 on paper because O'Malley was coming off that kind of robbery win over Peter Yan and Aljamain Sterling at the time. I think Sterling, Sterling was a bit of a boring champion. We all expected Sterling to go out there and kind of just have a boring win over Sean O'Malley, but O'Malley, just like Conor McGregor versus Jose Aldo fashion, pulls back, counters Sterling, knocks him out, and gets the massive underdog win. And O'Malley at the time was always labelled as a bit of a fraud, always going to get fraud checked at some point. So to see Sean O'Malley actually win a belt, a big star in the making, was a massive win. Probably the biggest knockout of 2024 as well. So O'Malley versus Vera, that's a great main event too. Alex versus Roundtree. On paper, I've given this one a 3 because at the time, Roundtree, I think, was ranked number 8. He was coming off 1 ranked win over Anthony Smith, and everyone was like, where's Ankalaev? Like, we thought the fight was going to be fun, but Roundtree was just such a random contender for Alex to face. But the fight itself has to be one of the best fights of 2024. Roundtree walked forward, ate Alex's best shots, fired back himself, dropped Alex in the first round, and this was just one of the best displays of warrior heart. Roundtree took a fucking beating. It was a fucking war until eventually his face was falling off. He kept walking forward. Alex was still hitting him. He just wouldn't go down. And I think this is where Roundtree, even though he lost, his stock raised massively from this fight. Like I said, one of the best fights of 2024. Roundtree versus Pereira. That's going to get a great main event as well. Now we're on to legendary main events. These are the ones that specifically stand out being absolutely legendary. Some of the best you can possibly ask for in a main event in the UFC. Legendary. Royval versus Tyra. I loved this fight. I mean, even on paper, you've got Tyra, who was undefeated at the time, coming off this massive winning streak. Brandon Royval coming off a win over Brandon Moreno. We thought this could potentially be a title eliminator for the flyweight division. This was a massive fight on paper. And the fight itself, I don't know why not many people talk about this. This is probably one of the best main events we've had in the Apex. Probably in a long, long time, because it was a scrap. It was a good mix of grappling from Tyra, a good mix of striking from Royval, Tyra damaging Royval on the ground, Royval bullying Tyra on the feet. It was a scrap across 25 minutes, high-paced. Neither of them seemed to gas out. They both brought it was high output. This is everything you could want in a fight. 2 frogs in a blender with a mix of striking and grappling. Probably one of the best flyweight fights we've seen in a while. And like I said, with the situation it being Tyra being undefeated, Royval being this big name, potential title eliminator too, this was a legendary main event. If we could have more main events like this in the Apex, sign me the fuck up. One of the best Apex main events we've ever had. Poirier versus Gaethje too. Yeah, on paper this was a 5. This was after Gaethje beat Fiziev and had that great performance, and Poirier went out there and finished Michael Chandler. They've both fought each other before. They're 2 big names. You know exactly what you're going to get for the BMF belt the second time around. This was a massive fight on paper, and the fight itself was great too. I mean, the first round they kind of felt each other out until eventually Justin Gaethje shoots up a massive head kick and slumps Dustin Poirier out cold. So I mean, the build-up was great. The situation was great. They both weren't necessarily washed at the time. And for Justin Gaethje to deliver that massive knockout as well, which could have potentially been a title eliminator too had he taken the fight with Makhachev. Massive for Justin Gaethje. So, yeah, this is a legendary main event. I've also gone Topuria versus Holloway. On paper, this is one of the most intriguing fights of 2024. Topuria, undefeated, just knocked out Alexander Volkanovski. Holloway was on a winning streak, and he just had that great performance over Justin Gaethje at 155. I think he was on a 3-fight winning streak. You've got the knockout artist versus the uncrackable chin. Two of some of the best boxers in the UFC. Topuria versus Holloway is one of the most exciting main events we had, and I've given it a 4. It was tough seeing Holloway get knocked out. They kind of, you know, they had a good, they were picking each other apart, mainly from Topuria in the first couple of rounds, until eventually Topuria goes out there, slumps Max Holloway, breaks the chin, becomes the first man to knock out Max Holloway as he knocks him out to take and defend the featherweight belt. So this is a legendary main event. The fight itself, the outcome, the way it ended, the build-up, legendary main event. Volkanovski versus Topuria 2 is also legendary. Yeah, on paper this was a 5 as well. Volkanovski defending his belt, just got knocked out by Makhachev, but was still undefeated in the featherweight division. You've got Ilia Topuria coming over, and again, it was hard to see Volkanovski get knocked out, but for Topuria to be the first guy ever to beat Volkanovski in the featherweight division, take the belt, was massive for Topuria's career. He slumps Volkanovski out cold, knocks him out, takes the belt after their big build-up they had as well. Legendary main event. We need more of these in the UFC. Holloway versus a Korean Zombie, again, legendary. On paper, if you've got Max Holloway in a fight night, you already know it's going to be massive for a fight night. So for a fight night main event, this was at least a 4 out of 5. And the fight itself, it was just everything about it. The walkout that Korean Zombie had to the zombie music in Singapore. Korean Zombie actually put up a good fight. He was walking forward and doing Korean Zombie things, having a scrap with Max Holloway, swinging. They both swung each other on the feet until eventually the knockout came. Korean Zombie just said, fuck it, let me go for the kill. Swings on Max Holloway, goes for the kill, and Holloway counters him and knocks him out cold. Face first to the canvas. This is one of the best main events, one of the best fight night main events I've seen in a long time. The build-up, the name value, it being in Singapore, the crowd, the fight itself, and then to put the cherry on top of the knockout. Legendary main event, Holloway versus Zombie. Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier. This is also a legendary main event. Now, people will argue that it's not a legendary build-up because Dustin Poirier, you know, wasn't really ever going to win the fight, but Dustin Poirier was a big name. He was corner for win over Benoit Saint-Denis, and there wasn't really any other top contenders at the time that was ready for Makhachev in the lightweight division. And the fight itself, I'm going to give it a 5. We all expected this to go exactly like Makhachev versus Moicano. Makhachev gets an easy submission win over Renato Moicano, gets the job done, but Dustin Poirier, fair play to him, he brought it to Makhachev. He got taken down, but then he'd get back up. Probably the most high-level fight we'd seen in a while. Makhachev looked good on the feet. Poirier looked good on the feet, had his moments too. Poirier getting back up from the takedowns, Makhachev shooting the takedowns, a perfect mix of striking and grappling in MMA. And then to put the cherry on top, Makhachev finishes Dustin Poirier in the 5th round. Yeah, this is a great fight. The build-up itself, the fight itself, like I said, potential fight of the year for 2024. Makhachev Poirier, legendary fight. I've gone with Yuri versus Alex 2. This was so exciting on paper. Yuri was undefeated in the UFC. He was coming off that injury, but apart from that, he'd been smoking Glover. He knocked out Reyes. He finished Glover. He finished Volkan Oezdemir. Yuri was in the ultimate form of his career coming back from the injury, and Alex was, I mean, I think at the time Alex had just beat Jan Blachowicz. He was this KO artist at middleweight, fighting for the belt in the light heavyweight division. One of the best fights you could have made in the light heavyweight division. And the fight itself was a 4. It was a competitive striking matchup. Yuri had his moments on the feet. Alex was catching Yuri, and then Yuri started to turn up, and then Alex just landed that left hook and knocks out Yuri. Now, the reason I'm not giving it a 5 on paper is because I think for it to be a 5, I mean, the only thing that's stopping it from being a 5 is the fact that it was arguably an early stoppage. Alex drops Yuri, fires down some elbows, and Mark Goddard stops the fight, but Yuri looked like he was still in the fight. So apart from the early stoppage, everything was perfect about this fight. So Yuri versus Alex, I'm giving this one a legendary, this was a legendary main event as well. I've also gone Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez. Yeah, at the time, this was a massive fight. Yair was the interim champion, coming off a bunch of good wins. Volkanovski just had that massive, massive performance, even though he lost to Islam Makhachev. So we're all excited to see Volkanovski main event again. And the fight itself was a 5. This was, in my opinion, Volkanovski's best performance. He was just bullied Yair on the feet, picked him apart, bullied him, cracked him. It was looking like a vintage Volkanovski performance. Yair starts firing back, landed a couple of shots, and then Volkanovski says, fuck it, fuck you, lands a massive overhand, wobbles Yair Rodriguez, gets him against the cage, has an amazing combination where he just starts punching him to the body, ripping up top, takes him down, continues the ground and pound, gets the finish. In my opinion, like I said, Volkanovski's best performance. the antics of the fight, everything about this legendary main event was Yair versus Volkanovski. I'm also going to go with this week's main event, Diego Lopez versus Gene Silva. The build-up was so intriguing. You had Gene Silva, the last hope of the fighting nerd. Everybody was saying this guy was going to be the next champion in the featherweight division. You've got Diego Lopez, consistently in fun fights, just came off that big title fight over Volkanovski. For a fight night main event in Mexico, this was massive. And the fight itself, people are already saying this is going to be the best fight of 2025. For Gene Silva to be a dick all week, be in enemy territory in Mexico, Diego Lopez to kind of be counted out, and just everything about this fight. Diego Lopez taking down Gene Silva, bullying him on the ground, slashing him open with elbows. They get back to the feet. Gene Silva starts firing back, starts landing on Diego Lopez, gets too comfortable. Spinning elbow comes from Diego Lopez, knocking out Gene Silva with his own move, going for the ground and pound finish and finishing Gene Silva, which a lot of people wanted to see as well. A lot of people were satisfied to see. Probably one of the best. You couldn't have asked for a better fight, a better build-up. Lopez versus Silva. That's also going to get legendary stats for me. I'm also going to go Alex versus Jamal Hill at UFC 300. This is going to get a 4 on paper. Now, Jamal Hill was undefeated. Well, he wasn't undefeated in the UFC. He lost to Paul Craig. But apart from Paul Craig, he was undefeated in the UFC. He was coming off that injury after he won the belt over Glover Teixeira. And Alex, at the time, had just knocked out Yuri Prohaska. So it was a massive build-up. 2 power punches. Some people thought Hill standed a chance. But because of how salty Jamal Hill was and, you know, how he kept talking shit before the fight, for Alex to go in there and in just over a minute, you know, gets kicked in the balls, waves off Herb Dean, hits him with the left hook and finishes Jamal Hill in satisfying fashion. This is one of the best main events of 2024 as well. So this is also a legendary main event that we've had in modern history. And Alex versus Yuri, another legendary. The second time around. Now I've given it a 4 on paper the second time around because it was on short notice. It was supposed to be McGregor Chandler. In come on short notice, Pereira versus Yuri, and Yuri hadn't fought anybody since he's lost to Pereira, which kind of made people a bit concerned. But the fight itself was a 5. This was Alex's most dominant performance. The fight starts, it's pretty competitive on the feet, and then in the last second of the first round, Alex clips Yuri with a left hook and knocks him out. But the fight doesn't get stopped because it's the end of the round. Second round comes along, first 5 seconds, head kick, boom, sleeps Yuri. Alex, yeah, this fight had highlight reel written all over it. So Alex versus Yuri 2 at UFC 303. Fair play for them for stepping up. That's also going to get a fight. That's also going to get a legendary status too. Makhachev versus Volkanovski. This was another legendary fight. I mean, this is the Terence Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez of MMA. Literally the definition. Pound for pound number 1 versus pound for pound number 1. The 2 best in the UFC. Volkanovski dominating featherweight, one of the most well-rounded in the world. Makhachev, fresh off winning that belt at 155, looked unstoppable. This was a huge fight. We don't really get best versus the best fights in the UFC. This was that. So on paper, one of the best fights you could have done. The build-up and everything. And the fight itself was a 4. You had Makhachev and Volkanovski putting on one of the closest fights, one of the most high-level fights you're ever going to see in MMA. Volkanovski picking apart Makhachev on the feet, dropping him in the 5th. Makhachev implementing the grappling, taking down Volkanovski. Both of them firing back with their own techniques. Like I said, the grappling from Makhachev and the striking from Volk. This was one of the most technical, one of the most high level, everything you'd want from pound for pound number 1 versus pound for pound number 2. I think the only issue is, I mean, first of all, it wasn't like an absolute barn burner scrap where they were both bloody and bruised and it was like a Michael Chandler Gaethje 2 frogs in a blender type match, but you didn't really expect that from this fight. And on top of that as well, a lot of people thought Volkanovski won this fight, so the fact that there wasn't really a decisive winner, a lot of people were bitching about it rather than just accepting the fight. But everything into account, Makhachev versus Volk, legendary fight. And finally, in my opinion, the best main event since 2023 in the UFC, out of every single main event, the ultimate best, Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira number 2. I mean, where do I start? The build, I mean, the whole build-up of the first fight in general, you know, they had Alex, who had beaten Adesanya twice in kickboxing, knocked him out in one of them as well. Izzy was the not undefeated in the UFC, but undefeated in the middleweight division, unstoppable middleweight champion. Alex hunts him down, goes through every contender in the UFC to find Adesanya, and they finally get their first fight. The first fight goes down, and Adesanya looked good. It was one of the highest level striking matchups you're ever going to see. Adesanya looked good about 4 rounds against Alex, and then the 5th round comes. Alex just had to beat Adesanya. The kryptonite of Adesanya gets the job done, wobbles him against the cage, gets the finish. Bit of an early stoppage, but he took the belt from Adesanya and was the kryptonite. And that for the second fight, again, this was fresh after Adesanya was looking good against Alex for 25 minutes, but Alex still got the job done. People thought Alex was going to be even more dangerous this time around. And for Adesanya to get one of the best KOs, honestly, in UFC history, the way that he did it as well, he was losing the fight to Alex. It looked like Alex was in control of the fight, and he gets Adesanya against the cage, just like the first time around. It was like it was written in some sort of anime, was this fight, and Adesanya would have loved that as well. in the sense that Adesanya pulls back, clips Alex against the cage, wobbles him, clips him again, knocks him out, knocks out his kryptonite that has been hunting him down on 3 different occasions. This was the 4th. Everything about this fight, the build-up, the rivalry, the best rivalry or one of the best rivalries we've ever had in the UFC, the finish itself, Alex versus Adesanya number 2, in my opinion, is the best main event in modern history, since 2023 at least. Everything into account, Adesanya, Pereira, best main event in modern UFC history, the second time around. But that is my ranking of every single main event in the UFC since 2023. Let me know if you agree, disagree, if you change anything around, if I've missed out any main events as well, because it's kind of hard to keep track of every single one of them. But let me know if I've missed any, let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.